Welcome. My name is Lucan Way. I am the co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for Ukrainian Studies at the Center for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto, the Munk School. As all of you know, there are right now about 130,000 Russian troops on three sides of the Ukrainian border. And the big question in everybody's mind is what's going to happen next? And will Russia invade? Russia says they're not going to invade. Who knows why the Russian troops are there if they're not going to invade? What does Putin want? Will there be an invasion? If so, what kind of invasion? Are we talking about a full-scale occupation of Ukraine or more minimal type of invasion, a quick in and quick out? And finally, the sort of impossible or very difficult question, what does Putin want? And why is he doing this? Is it because of NATO? Is it because of Russian domestic politics? What is going on? So today we have three people to sort of begin to sort of investigate these questions. The first is Brian Taylor, who is a specialist in Russia. He's written 3 different books, all of which kind of are very pertinent to the current crisis. Most recently, he's written a book, The Code of Putinism, in 2018 with Oxford University Press. Brian also is a well-known expert in Russian security services and the Russian military, having written 2 books on the security services and a monumental book in 2003 on the history of the Russian army since 1689. Then we have, straight from Kharkiv, we have Maria Avdeeva. She's the research director at the European Expert Association. She focuses on international security, and her specific focus of research has been on disinformation and information warfare, which is clearly a big part of this crisis. Finally, from Boston, we have Oxana Shevel, my good friend, who is an expert in Ukrainian politics. She got her PhD from Harvard. She's a professor at Tufts University. She has written extensively on citizenship politics and refugee politics. She has a 2011 book on refugee policies and state building in post-communist Europe. She's more recently done research on the crisis, on citizenship policies, on church-state relations. So without further ado, I think I'm going to start off with Brian and get his take on what is going on. A lot of this crisis is about figuring out what is in one guy's head. Brian insists that this is not a stupid question, so he's going to tell us why. Then we're going to go to Maria to talk about sort of the information warfare, and then we'll end with Oksana, who's going to talk about the Ukrainian domestic angle. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Lucan, and thanks for the invitation. I look forward to learning from Maria and Oksana and Lucan and the audience in the discussion. So Lucan sort of got us going by raising the issue of what does Putin really want, and I was talking to the panelists beforehand, and I said, well, it's not really a stupid question, and even though I think a lot of people are tired of the question, and I think the reason people ask it is because we're in a situation in which Russian domestic politics, at least on issues like this, really comes down to what Vladimir Putin decides he wants to do. So to get us started with the discussion, I want to raise 2 different questions. The first is why now? And the second is what is this really about? They're obviously somewhat interrelated. In terms of why now, I'm going to frame it in terms of, is Russia on the offensive or is it on the defensive from its point of view? And then the second question, what's this about? Is it about Ukraine, or is it a bigger issue of the European security order? So in terms of why now, there are 2 basic accounts out there. One is the offensive account, which sees Putin as aggressive, a revisionist actor, out to recreate, if not the Soviet Union itself, then a de facto version of it in which Russia has a sphere of influence and shapes not just the foreign policy of many of its neighbors, but even their internal politics. And further, this aggressive version of Putin is out to weaken and challenge the collective West. Sow chaos in individual countries, create fissures in NATO and the EU in order to sort of remake the international security order. And according to this way of thinking about it, the reason this crisis comes now is because, from Putin's point of view, the US, the EU, and NATO are all weak and divided. So the US is internally divided. This was most evident a year ago on the January 6th events in Washington. Some people have suggested that Putin also sees the United States as externally weak, with the so-called chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan as sort of an important piece of evidence for that. Just parenthetically, I would say we could actually argue the opposite, that the United States getting out of a rather low priority region that was draining resources may actually allow it to focus more on countries like Russia and China. But this is at least one of the arguments out there. So Putin started this crisis in some ways not, this fall and winter, but last spring with the deployment of Russian forces to the border with Ukraine. And he got a much desired summit with Biden out of that event. If we look at the EU, we have Brexit, we have the Johnson government in crisis, we have the departure of Merkel in Germany and a new coalition German government, and we have French elections coming up in a couple of months. So all together, this is seen as making it hard for the EU and NATO to act as a coherent actor. Ivo Daalder, who was the former American ambassador to NATO, said recently on Twitter that this show of force by Putin was designed to crack open the internal divisions within NATO and force it to agree to his terms. So that's one way this crisis has been framed. A second way sees Putin as a more defensive actor from his own perspective. And this starts with the premise that for Putin, Ukraine is a huge foreign policy priority, but it's also the source of his biggest foreign policy failure. No matter how hard he has tried over the last 20 plus years, Ukraine slips further and further out of Russia's control and Russia's orbit and is moving towards the West. And this is not only true in terms of foreign policy, but also domestically. So if we think about the events in Ukrainian politics, which I'm not a specialist on, but at least a few things I'd like to highlight now is that over the last year, President Zelensky has taken a harder line towards Russian interests in Ukraine, including with respect to Putin's friend, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's under house arrest and whose TV stations have been closed down that were more pro-Russian in their orientation. Putin has become obsessed for some reason with the Indigenous Peoples Law that was adopted in Ukraine last year. The law actually has nothing to do with ethnic Russians or any other ethnic minority that has a state abroad. But he's described this law as a weapon of mass destruction and compared it to Nazi theory and practice. So from this way of looking at things, in Putin's mind, it's perhaps not a coincidence that this internal sort of change of the Ukrainian domestic politics towards Russia happened at roughly the same time that Biden came to power. Last summer, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, said Ukraine is simply an American vassal. And there's no point in talking to Kyiv because Washington calls the shots. And you might think that Putin thinks that anything that Zelensky did, he sort of gets the green light from Washington. So that's where the real problem is. In terms of foreign policy and defense, Ukraine obviously is a major recipient of US military aid and training. It bought drones from Turkey, another NATO country. The UK sent a warship through waters that Russia considers its territorial waters off Crimea last summer. So regardless of whether or not Ukraine has any hope of joining NATO soon, from Russia's point of view or from Putin's point of view, NATO is already in Ukraine. And some people have described this as, from Putin's point of view, a Western aircraft carrier parked on Russia's border. So which of these views is right, the offensive or the defensive sort of account of what Putin is doing and why now? They're clearly not mutually exclusive, but I think from his point of view, he sees this as more a defensive thing where Ukraine is seeking to align with the West, and he simply doesn't believe and can't accept that this is a natural choice for Ukraine because he sees the Ukrainian people and the Russian people as one people, in the Ukrainian state as an artificial creation. So if it's getting closer to the West, then somebody, and read here the US, has to be dragging it that direction. We saw a similar reaction by Putin to the events of 2004, the Orange Revolution in 2014 in terms of Euromaidan. Just one more point on this issue. He's probably getting a lot of his information, or he is, on Ukraine from a narrow group of former Chekists, KGB officials who share his worldview and frame things in a way that appeals to his pre-existing prejudices with respect to Ukraine. So I don't see a scenario in which the use of Russian military force in an expanded way beyond what it's already done would help Putin achieve his objectives, but he may interpret things very differently. And then the second question, just a couple minutes on what's this about. Is it about the European security order, or is it specifically about Ukraine? So those who were talking about this as a challenge to the entire European order, this may be related to the view that Putin is on the offensive right now. And basically, Putin is trying to get a better deal in terms of Russia's place in Europe now that he sees NATO and the US as potentially weaker. Russia has shown it can use force effectively in places like Georgia and Syria and Ukraine, and he may think he can sort of get a better bargain at this point. So we see very expansive security demands, not just asking that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO at any point, but also the withdrawal of NATO forces from countries that joined the alliance after 1997. So that means places like Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and so on. So it seems to be about a much bigger ambition. And Angela Stent from Georgetown has called this an attempted third rearrangement of the European security order in the last 100 years, the first being Yalta in 1945, and the second, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But I think it's really probably more to do with Ukraine specifically than it is just about the European security order. He wants to halt the Ukrainian trajectory, and he understands that that NATO is not going to close its so-called open door. And he also, I think, understands that there's no prospect of Ukrainian membership in NATO anytime soon. I think it's probably more about what's happening in Ukrainian politics. And he's unhappy about Europe, but he really feels the need to do something in the shorter term about Ukraine. So let me make one final point about this, and it's a point about Belarus, actually. So the fall of 2020, Russia was faced with the prospect of a color revolution in Belarus that could have been, if not necessarily hostile to Russia, then certainly more friendly to the West. At that point, Putin helped save Lukashenko and has now made him much more dependent than he was before. Russia is now deploying troops there for scheduled exercise. Quote unquote exercises, but it's clearly part of pressure on Ukraine. The Belarusian Ministry of Defense has said its troop will leave after the exercises, but I think we should also keep an eye on whether Russia starts to regularly rotate forces in and out of Belarus, which would be, a real coup in some sense for Putin if he was able to change Belarusian status vis-a-vis the security arrangements in Europe, as a product of this crisis. So I will stop there and turn it back to Lucan. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Great, Maria.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Lucan, for the invitation and the great overview that Brian did. I actually fully agree with what has been said. And what I would like to add is the disinformation campaign unfolding right now that Russia is very good at, and that we have seen for many years. And now they are even more active, or the same active as it happened in 2014. So I live in Kharkiv, and I have seen in 2014 the Russian flags and Russian nationals came to the city trying to build the Kharkiv National Republic here, the same as happened in Donetsk and Lugansk. And what happened next when they didn't manage to do it? And since then, we see that anti-Russian sentiment is constantly growing, and the generation of young people who are living in the state of war with Russia is constantly growing. And so this pro-Western and anti-Russian sentiment for this almost 8 years has grown significantly, and the pro-Russian parties are losing their position. So Putin really feels that, and I think that's one of the points that makes Kremlin nervous. But I will speak more on the disinformation and disinformation-led campaign that we see now. We see that the Kremlin is preparing the information field for some sort of provocations, because for the last, so it started about mostly about 2 months ago in November. And since that time, Russian and pro-Kremlin media are pushing the narrative that Ukraine is preparing some kind of aggression against Donbass, against Russia itself, and against Belarus. And this narrative is constantly growing, and we see it how it develops through social platform very popular in Ukraine called Telegram. So we see such messages appear there, and then from Telegram it turns to the mainstream Russian media, and after that the Russian officials or Russian politicians start talking about that. So where for these 2 months, where this has bring us, where we are now. Now Russia is almost openly saying that Ukraine, with the support of the Western countries, has concentrated many military means and weapons on the border with Donbass and ready to attack. So that's the main disinformation narrative: Ukraine preparing attack on Donbass. And that's why Russian politicians are starting talking about whether to give the so-called DNR and LNR, the terrorist republics, whether to admit their statehood. So it's been the question of discussion in Russian politics. But on the other hand, we understand that's another point of pressure on Ukraine. If the Ukrainian territory, not now controlled by pro-Russian forces, will be admitted and will be seen as the sovereign states by Russia. So this is on the one hand. The second narrative is that Western countries that are supplying weapons and help to defend Ukraine are helping Ukraine in plotting this kind of attacks on the so-called republics. And every day there is different messages, different disinformation messages popping up about how someone has witnessed, for example, British special forces or Canadian special forces or American special forces near the Donbass, and they were preparing some kind of attack on the civilians living their peaceful life in Donbass. Having that, we also see, as Brian has mentioned, Russian troops being deployed to Belarus. And Alexander Lukashenko, who is in the complete dependence from Kremlin since since the elections, the so-called elections in 2020, which he actually lost, but then after Putin gave him hand, now Lukashenko is in complete dependence on the Kremlin. And by this, Russia uses him as as their proxy. And Lukashenko on his speech, on his last speech, when he was referring to the people of Belarus, he said that we, referring to we as Belarus and Russia as a union state, we want to bring back Ukraine to our Slavic unity, and meaning that that whatever means it will take the union state for that. Of course, we here understand that it's not in Lukashenko's interest to take part into any sort of military provocations with Russia, because by doing that, everything will be, so any kind of cooperation with Ukraine will be closed for him. I mean, economic relations and what has been left after his stolen elections. But on the other hand, we do understand that Putin is pushing him, and Lukashenko has already said that he is ready to deploy a Russian nuclear weapon on the territory of Belarus, which is seen as another point of influence and another place where Putin is creating tensions around Ukraine. So these new military drills announced by Lukashenko and Putin will take place from 10th to 20th to the 20th of February. And in this time, the Olympics are taking place in China, and that's why it's been highly discussed here if this period will be used for some kind of provocation organized by Russian special services, whether in Donbass or on the border with of Ukraine and Belarus, so that it will allow Kremlin to say that Ukraine is attacking, and then Russia or the Union of Russia and Belarus needs to defend itself. And then, for example, if it happens in Donbass, then the so-called volunteers could come and help. And why I'm so sure about that, because today there was the message by the former head of the terrorist organization LNR, who is now the member of the Russian State Duma, Baradai. So he said that they already have 16,000 volunteers from Russia who are ready to come to Donbass and help defend the territory of Donbass from Ukrainian forces who want to push forward and get the land of Donbass. And he openly admits that Russian officers are taking part in that as a commanders in that volunteers organization. And that really creates a very disturbing and very dangerous line, and which we can see can be realized as one of the possible scenarios in the very near future. And I would also like to say a couple of words about the recent cyber attacks, which you all have probably heard about. So they happened a couple of weeks ago. How it looked like, the hackers defamed most of the Ukrainian governmental defamed sites, internet sites of most of the Ukrainian governmental ministries. So there was the message there leading Ukrainians to think that the Poland actually organized that. So it was very quickly debunked as a disinformation and a misleading thing, but mostly sure the hackers had in mind for us, for Ukraine, to think that this attack has been made by the Polish side. For now, the authorities are still attributing this attack, but mostly 100% sure everyone knows that it was organized by Russian hackers, because we have seen such kinds of attacks on Ukrainian networks before, and it was completely agreed that these attacks were done by the Russian hackers. And when I say Russian hackers, we all should understand that the groups of Russian hackers are very much and very tightly connected with the Russian special services, and they allow them or ask them to do the work they need to be done, be it in the United States, in Europe, or in Ukraine. So with this attack, one was defacing the Ukrainian governmental sites, and the other that was more severe was trying to hit the critical infrastructure behind that sites. And the Ukrainian authorities and cybersecurity experts say that they are still working on finding everything and finding the pieces of malware probably put into the networks of the governmental sites. But by doing that, the people who created that attack and who orchestrated it, they wanted to show chaos in the society, to threaten the society, and to show that any moment they can hit the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, together with military threat and together with economic threats and with all other threats that Russia now uses against Ukraine. So by saying that, I would probably stop, and then when we move to the discussion, probably I will focus on something more specifically.
Great, thank you, Maria. Indeed, there's been a really interesting change in Lukashenko and Belarus's behavior. I mean, Lukashenko, almost, many years ago, refused to recognize Abkhazia and Ossetia. I mean, he was, very much kind of acting independently of Putin's foreign policy. So this is a real shift. Great. So Oksana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lucan. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, okay, great. So I'll talk about the current crisis through the lens of Ukrainian domestic political developments and certain misperceptions about them, I would say, that exist in Russia, but also on the part of some Western analysts. And I think attention to these domestic political developments and domestic political process more broadly can help us understand both the origins of the current crisis and its more or less likely resolutions, including the probabilities of Russian military invasion. So I'll kind of try to unpack this a little bit. So let me start with a very brief background. Those of us who study Ukraine, or even if you read about Ukraine in the news, I think it is fair to say that since 1991, Ukraine was often has been presented as sort of a divided country, right? That these divisions are quite complex, they're much more nuanced, and sort of there are many layers to it than just sort of simple pro-Russian East and South and pro-Ukrainian quote unquote West. But without going into the sort of the nuance of these divisions, the broad, I think, pattern was important, and this is something Lucan actually also wrote about in his work, that whoever was in power in Kyiv, be it sort of pro-Russian president or more pro-Ukrainian and pro-Western president, there was always a natural support for the opposition. In other words, pro-Russian electorate, for example, in the south and east of the country, or more Russia-friendly electorate, always was there, to support and ultimately vote for a more Russia-friendly president. And that also gave Russia a natural leverage over political process in Ukraine. So if we look at, again, very briefly, I'm not going to go into detail, but kind of the pattern of alternating presidential elections in Ukraine since 91, we basically see, presidents coming to power on either sort of more pro-Russian or more pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western foreign policy agenda, invariably disappointing voters, failing to solve issues with corruption, economic development, judicial independence, and so forth, and then being voted out of office by, the other part, the other half, we can say, of the electorate. And this pattern didn't even change even after 2004 Orange Revolution, when pro-Western President Yushchenko comes to power. He again disappoints voters by lackluster domestic policies, and then Yanukovych, more pro-Russian candidate, wins in the free election. So the point that I'm making here, that I think Ukrainian electoral geography and sort of, the geographic historical reality gave Russia natural leverage over the affairs of the course of events in Ukraine. Not full control, of course, but substantial leverage through this sort of natural pro-Russian electoral presence in the south and east of the country, also, of course, via the oligarchs, via Ukraine's dependence on Russian natural gas, large audience media, TV, and so forth. So if we fast forward then to 2013, 2014, and the ouster of Yanukovych by the Euromaidan protests, and this is, of course, when kind of the origins of the current crisis would be dated back to, with Russia moving to annex Crimea and support separatism in Donbass. What actually changed, or would have changed after 2014? I would actually argue that not much would have changed, in fact. As Brian already mentioned, NATO membership was not on the table at the time. I don't think NATO members were eager to accept Ukraine. That seemed very distant possibility. Moreover, in Ukraine, there wasn't even support for this. That has changed. I'll come back to it in a minute. But up until 2014, there was no more than 20-25% of the population who would actually support, let's say, NATO membership in a referendum. Electoral geography also didn't change that much, right? So the Euromaidan had, again, regionally lopsided support. There was more support for Euromaidan uprising in the west and the center of the country than in the south and the east. And it's more likely than not, I would say, that again, had kind of Ukrainian domestic political process played itself out without Russian intervening and annexing Crimea and moving in Donbass, we basically probably would have seen whichever pro-Western president was elected in 2014 then being replaced by more Russia-friendly president in the subsequent elections, right? And Russia would have retained many, if not most, of its leverage over Ukraine, and again was in a position to achieve its stated objective, if that's indeed, its objective, to preventing Ukraine's membership in NATO, and at least to some degree, certainly having influence over what's happened in the Ukrainian domestic political process, right? Now, of course, that has changed dramatically, as we know, right? Instead of using this levers of influence that Putin did have over Ukraine, instead he moved to annex Crimea and foment insurgency in Donbass. And I would argue that these actions were a major miscalculation, and that instead of preventing, they actually accelerated Ukraine's move away from Russia. And sort of more specifically, I would say Russian aggression fundamentally changed two things in Ukrainian domestic politics that reduced Russian leverage instead of increasing it. First of all, it cut off, just mathematically, about 12% of the Ukrainian electorate, and we're talking about the most pro-Russian voters in Crimea and in eastern Donbass, from Ukrainian electoral process, which makes it mathematically much more difficult, I would say potentially now impossible, for sort of more pro-Russian candidate to win a national level election. And secondly, Russia's action in 2014 also turned public opinion in the rest of the country, including in traditionally kind of Russia-friendly South and East, quite negatively against Russia and in favor of NATO. Just to give one example, if before, as I said, before 2014, no more than 20-25% at most of Ukrainian public supported NATO membership, now the support approaching 60%, and that's from the November poll. And maybe if the poll was conducted now, it might be even higher. Of course, there is still regional variation. The South and the East is less enthusiastic about NATO than, say, the West and the center. But even in the South and the East, and here I can reference recent research by Ola Onuch and her colleagues from the Mobilize project, who have done several waves of research in the South, polling in the South and the East, and they find that between 2019 and 2021, just in the Southern and Eastern regions, support for NATO doubled, right? So that's also very important. So here we sort of have this ironic outcome, I would say, that Russia, by trying to supposedly increase its security, has produced consequences in Ukraine that actually makes its objectives now much further, less likely to be achieved than they could have been achieved had it not acted the way it did. Now, just to move along, I just want to make 2 points. That why, right? So yes, so Russia, I would say, made this mistake, and the origins, I think, of this mistake goes to something. I'll be echoing something Brian already said, kind of seeing Ukraine as deprived of agency, and basically looking at developments in Ukraine through this kind of great power geopolitical struggle. So essentially, Russia greatly overestimates, I would say, the role of US in Ukrainian domestic process. So again, this narrative that, both Euromaidan uprising and, many other sort of developments in Ukraine that Russia doesn't like, somehow a result of US meddling. So it's not popular mobilization against, Yanukovych's corrupt rule, but it is somehow, US basically was trying to intervene, right? And another kind of related rationale, and also there's something Brian already mentioned, by seeing Ukrainians as being essentially one nation with Russia and not a real state, as Putin have said himself, I think we should take him seriously at his word. There is no reason to think that he actually doesn't believe it, right? Again, it sort of seems that Ukraine is not only deprived of agency, but it is by definition cannot, like true Ukrainians cannot harbor any sort of opinion or preference that would be against what Russia wants, right? Because if you are sort of naturally part of one nation, right, the real Ukrainians must see this. And then what it leads to the dismissal on the part of Russian leadership, and we have hard evidence for it, Putin himself talking about at one of the recent, the latest Valdai meeting, I believe, but the opinion polls that actually show this change in preferences in Ukraine are somehow not real. So either he says that people are afraid to express their true pro-Russian preferences because they are ruled by quote unquote fascists, and they're basically, these are falsified preferences, right? And that's, I think, is pretty dangerous because it basically, it is sort of self-fulfilling, right? As Brian said, we don't, know who exactly feeding him this information. He may genuinely believe this, but we basically have this kind of two-pronged, I would say, misperception of what goes in Ukraine, that everything there, almost everything, is either as a result of US meddling, or it is basically these falsified preferences, and real Ukrainians would welcome more Russia-friendly policy, and that narrative seems to continue. So what do we have now, right? If we fast forward, we can say to wrap up a few implications for the current situation, right? We, of course, nobody, certainly not me, in a position to make any firm predictions as to what Putin will or will not do. But I would argue that given this domestic political landscape in Ukraine that I have just kind of sketched out, I think success of a military action by Russia to achieve its stated goals is really unlikely without full invasion and sustained occupation of Ukraine. And that in turn is very costly, right? Which may make invasion maybe less likely, right, or potentially avoidable, right, than some Western media has been reporting. I think it also goes to show that Ukrainian leadership, President Zelensky's specific attempts to downplay US warnings of an imminent Russian invasion may actually be rooted in this appreciation of the implications of Ukrainian domestic realities for an invasion scenario. Let me just say a couple of words on this, and then I'll end with this, right? So Russia certainly can use military might to defeat Ukrainian army. It will be costly on both sides, right? But then it still would face a challenge of controlling the territory and ruling the population that's essentially hostile, right? And how do you accomplish this? If we look again at the polls, just by way of illustration, in a December poll shows that 50% nationwide were prepared to actively resist Russian aggression, 33% with arms, and another 20-some% resisting without arms, right? In the South, the corresponding figures are 30%, in the East, 26%. Of course, we don't know what percent will actually resist. It could be less, right? But also could be people who are sort of incredulous and apolitical now and undecided may actually turn away, from Russia even more if rockets and tanks and so forth rolls across the border, right? So this, I would say, makes scenarios that have been again circulated, including by the British intelligence, of this sort of rule from afar by way of proxy government following some military blitzkrieg really quite fanciful. I think as long as there is Western unambiguous condemnation and sanctions, if Russia actually did invade, I think Ukrainian leadership can only stand not to fall, but actually gain support from sort of rally around the flag phenomena. Then if Zelensky were to fall in the face of protests, say, following military defeat, I think it would only be replaced by even more anti-Russian sort of nationalist government, right? And then any kind of pro-Russian puppet government, if, say, somebody was tapped to be this person, it's actually kind of ironic that even this, politician Murayev, who was listed in the British intelligence report, distanced himself almost immediately from it. But any such government would essentially have zero support. There is no public support, any government institution or elite group that would back this government. So the government would essentially have zero legitimacy, and the only way it could rule would be through sustained military backing by Russia, which means lengthy occupation with hundreds of thousands of troops. The question is Russia prepared to engage in a protracted and bloody war, face massive sanctions, and still not be able to achieve its goals in Ukraine? Like, we don't really know, but I think when Zelensky is sort of, says that the warnings of imminent invasion may be a little bit overstated, I think there are reasons to actually, say that that's indeed not a wrong perception. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope that's okay, Lucan, and maybe there will be more questions. I have a few other things to say, but I'm going to leave them for now.
Great. Thank you very much, Oksana. So I think Oksana's presentation raises actually important questions about, what Russia's intentions are. I mean, if we believe you, Brian, that his intentions are, either defensive or offensive, I'm wondering whether the third option, and in fact, that this has little to do with foreign relations per se, but much more to do with domestic Russian politics. And indeed, his behavior seems designed to amplify the NATO threat. I mean, almost, he claims he wants to reduce the NATO threat, but his actions are almost certainly going to result in more NATO troops on his borders. As Oksana has eloquently argued, it's dramatically increased support for NATO within Ukraine. I mean, so I guess the question is, and also I think in the long term, we may see countries like Germany disengaging themselves from Russian energy supplies. So I mean, I guess the question is, is Putin stupid? I don't know, incompetent, truly misguided, or does he really just not care? I mean, obviously he wants to get rid of NATO, but his primary concern is actually turning NATO into a bogeyman. And Sam Green has said that sort of NATO presents the perfect bogeyman. It looks threatening, it's highly divided, and it actually has no intention of harming Russia. So in that sense, it's great for Russian domestic politics. What do you say to that, Brian?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I personally am not persuaded by the argument that this is really a move about Russian internal politics. I think that the Russian state has shown over the last year that it's perfectly capable of controlling its domestic political situation through a combination of very strong use of sticks and the control over state media. So the Duma elections they had last September, turned out fine for them. Navalny's in jail. His organization is in tatters, and everyone has had to flee the country. They've been, branded terrorists and extremists and foreign agents and all the rest. And there's nothing imminent on the Russian political calendar that would force the government into some kind of artificial rally around the flag kind of operation. Now, I suppose you could say, the poor state response to COVID with over 1 million excess deaths now since the start of the pandemic, and the poor state of the economy and high rates of inflation. But none of that adds up to a scenario that is going to lead to large numbers of Russians protesting in the streets or anything like that. So I'm skeptical of this rally story. And to answer the second part of the question, just briefly, is he stupid or what? I really want to emphasize the point that I kind of alluded to earlier, and Oksana drove home even further. This all goes back to his original mistake in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, right? I mean, there's this old expression, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Or I guess the Russian expression is, about stepping on the same rake over and over again. They made a big mistake. I think if the long-term goal for Putin was to have Ukraine within a Russian sphere of influence, they made a big mistake in that respect in 2014, and there's no way to reverse it at this point. I suppose we could say he should say sorry. He could say sorry and give everything back, but obviously that's not going to happen. So over time, the Russian influence is going to continue to decline in Ukraine. So that's why I think we're in this situation where he's contemplating actions, and we don't know the range, but right, the theories have gone everything from full-scale invasion designed to occupy much of the east of the country, including Kiev, to cyber operations and maybe annexing the LNR and DNR and everything in between. None of those things are going to improve his position in Ukraine, whether it's the smallest possible operation or the biggest possible operation. So in that sense, looking at it rationally, I think he's stuck. But we don't know what information he's operating under. And I think he feels a certain sense of urgency to try and fix this quote unquote unfinished business. That's what Andrew Weiss and Eugene Rumor called it in a piece a couple of months ago. And so that's why I think we're where we are now. But I agree with you that I can't see this working out well.
It's interesting. I remember Mikhail Kostyanov visited the University of Toronto, and I asked him, this is around the Orange Revolution, and all these sorts of conspiracy theories that the Orange Revolution was, sponsored by the CIA and the like, and you sort of wonder, like, does Putin actually believe it? And I asked him, and he said, absolutely. I mean, he completely believes what he says, that these movements are completely foreign controlled. So that kind of speaks to your point that it's really about misperception. I guess, so Oksana, can you talk to me a little bit more about the disagreement between Biden and President Zelensky in terms of why does Zelensky want to sort of tamp down the concern? I mean, if you could, does he not? I mean, I find the sort of position a little bit puzzling. There are 130,000 troops on the border, and they're saying, well, invasion, at least to the unaided eye, seems pretty likely. Why would he want to tamp down that talk about invasion?
Yeah, well, I think there are various reasons. I mean, for one, you don't want to sow panic, right? Like, I mean, if you say like, okay, like there is imminent invasion, right? The market collapses, right? Like, you can imagine all sorts of, like, in a way, sort of Russia achieves at least partly its, objective by not doing anything, right? Now, that said, it's not to say that you shouldn't be preparing, right? I mean, from what I'm hearing from Ukraine, there are some, leaflets being distributed to the population that seems pretty, not very widespread, right? But I think, like, what's sort of broader point that I would say, I think if you look at the situation, like, as you said, right, there are 130,000 troops on the border. Putin is threatening the military technical response, whatever that means, right? Like, they made these demands that the West rejected. And on the face of it, it looks like, of course, like, if you've done this, like, what else are you going to do? Like, you sort of back yourself in the corner, as Brian says, like, you have to act, right? But then if you sort of step back and look at this broader context in which this action would unfold, which is this Ukrainian domestic context that as it stands now, right, this becomes a very, very costly move, right? It's not to say that Putin definitely will not move. I don't think any of us, probably Zelensky himself is not prepared to give anything like this guarantee. But I think it seems like there is substantial downside, right, to any kind of move from those troops. So I think this is where Zelensky is coming from. So maybe, Western analysis looks kind of like just on the hard facts, like number of military, like, are they, ready, like how many more guns they have, like, what Putin said. And maybe, from the Ukrainian standpoint, they are looking at sort of the context, including domestic context, in which then these next steps would unfold, right? And then you can sort of see that it's actually not necessarily a Russian election on the part of Putin, right? So I think that could be, I mean, again, obviously, I don't know what's in Zelensky's head, but I think that could be what is driving his sort of tempering down, right, the imminence of it, right?
Great. So we actually have a really important question from Professor Keith Darden. I think I'm going to direct it at you, Maria. It's about the sort of Eastern Ukrainian regional elites in Kharkiv. I mean, is there any chance that they, in the event of invasion, that they would sort of work out deals with the invaders, or how, in a sense, are you confident that they're going to stay on the side of Ukraine in the event of an invasion, or what do you see?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I also have a small comment on what already Oksana and Brian has said. So I think one of the possible scenarios Putin might want to bring to Ukraine is the internal destabilization. And what we have seen in the recent days is the Ministry of Internal Affairs saying that they have arrested people that were preparing the coup inside Ukraine. And then the FSB agent was today arrested in Kharkiv. And I think that this is what might be one of the plans. So if we look on Donbass, say something, some regional military operations happens there, and Ukrainians are unsatisfied with with how government deals with that, and then it can sort of fuel up internal unsatisfaction with Zelensky, and already now his power, his political party is losing the voters. So I think that might be the possible scenario. And yes, Murayev and people like him are not so popular, but for example, in Eastern Ukraine now, generally the pro-Russian political parties have about roughly 20% of people supporting them. So if you would work on that, I mean, not you, but then the people from Russia, for Kremlin, then they can be used to destabilize the situation inside the country. So it's just one of my thoughts. And answering to the question, I don't believe that could happen, because we have already been through it, as I have mentioned, in 2014, and the mayor of Kharkiv presented at that time here. He was quite having many ties with Russia, and before that he was wearing, Russian symbols. But when he was on the edge that Kharkiv might turn to what has happened with Donbass, with Donetsk and Lugansk, he didn't want that, because all of these people, they have businesses and they want their businesses to be safe, and they want to preserve their power. They do not want, for them, what happened to the leaders inside Donbass, when some of them were killed, others were thrown by the Russian special services, and the people more from the Russian side were put on their places. So now when everyone see what happened to Donbass, so now it's the depopulated territory where nobody wants to live, where is no future. So there is a very little chance that anyone, even if he feels somehow pro-Russian, would want Russian forces to come to the city and get power.
Great. Can you just talk a little bit about the kind of the feeling on the street in Kharkiv, and sort of, is there a sense of imminent war?
Yeah.
Or is it like, what is it like?
Roughly around more than 50% of people on the recent poll said they are ready to defend with the armors their territory. So everybody, well, sometimes international journalists ask, why are you so calm? It's because the city has already been through it in 2014, and we live 40 kilometers from the border with Russia. So it's just almost no distance at all. So if Putin is crazy enough and decides to invade, they will be here, the Russian tanks, like in half a day. But but everyone believes that we will be defending our territory, and we have many people. It's roughly 500,000 people who already have the combat experience, who have been through war in Donbass, who are trained, who know what to do with their guns. Because in 2014, the army was not in that condition. But now, in 8 years, there are like many territorial defense units, and women, go into the courses on weekend and learning how to participate in these insurgency actions, or how to give the medical help. So people are not worried, but they are prepared, because if you cannot change anything, you just have to prepare yourself for the worst scenario.
Great, thanks.
Could I look and just add like 2 sentences to this question? I totally second everything Maria said. I think another, if you sort of think of the parallels with 2014, right, like to Keith's question, I think the elites now face quite different calculation, right? Because in 2014, there was this government that was essentially, there was power vacuum in Kiev, right? Like there was also in sort of the places where this succeeded, in these parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, there was quite substantial anti-Maidan sort of, right, protest sentiment. It wasn't, I would say it was not decisive, but it was a necessary piece. It wasn't sufficient by itself, but it was a necessary piece to the outcome that we have, right? And I think now we have quite different, right? Like the legitimacy of the central government is not in question, right? So the local elites, like if they're wavering, right, like why would they be wavering this way? As Maria said, right, the alternative of becoming the second LNR and DNR is not particularly bright, right? And of course, I would just the last thing that I mentioned here, I think also if we think about the state vacuum in 2014, when say pro-Ukrainian protesters, if who did exist, they would be afraid to come out in Donetsk because they would get basically beaten up as police stood by, right? Like that would be a different situation now. So if in Kharkiv or elsewhere in Mariupol, there were, alternative demonstrations, I think the pro-Ukrainian ones not only would be larger, but they wouldn't fear that police would stand by and let them be beaten up by the pro-Russian thugs, which I think was different in 2014, again, because of the state vacuum back then.
Great. The question for you, Brian, I understand your point is very well taken that there isn't any sort of imminent important election in Russia. And, furthermore, obviously the Russian opposition is completely pulverized. On the other hand, Putin, does seem to care a lot about public opinion polls. To the extent that when opinion, when support goes down to the 60%, which would be the dream of most other, candidates in a democracy, they seem to worry. I guess the question is what do you think, Putin's tolerance for casualties are? You seem to paint a picture that they don't care about public opinion, or I'm putting words in your mouth. Would that sort of dissuade them because for fear of that this war might become unpopular?
I guess I would not say that they don't care about public opinion. What I would say is they have no reason to be alarmed at it at this moment. So if we look at scenarios in which Russia decides to use force in some capacity in Ukraine, I think, what the polls show so far is that most people are kind of primed to blame it on NATO and Ukraine and not to blame it on Russia. It's like 60% say, they blame it on NATO and Ukraine, and 4% say they would blame it on Russia. But that's a different question than how people would respond if they woke up one day and their country was at war and, reserves were being mobilized and there was major coverage on the news about war, and people were hearing about, friends and neighbors coming home in coffins and that kind of thing. That's a very different scenario than we're in right now. So I don't think it's going to be easy to predict how Russian public opinion would react. And a lot depends on the scenario. If it's a minimal kind of operation or if it's a larger operation, this is under the assumption that there is some kind of operation, obviously. My gut feeling, and I think some of the stuff that's written by Russian sociologists about this backs this up, is Russians are not interested in a war right now. So although they're primed to, think it's the West's fault, it's NATO's fault, it's America's fault, or whatever, that's very different from saying that they are imagining a scenario in which they're at war with Ukraine. It just sounds kind of crazy to, I think, average Russians on the street that they would be in a major war with Ukraine. So I would hope that the Russian government is a bit concerned about that and doing some polling of their own and focus groups of their own to see what the mood is out there, because I don't think there's a bellicose mood on the streets in Russia these days.
Okay, great. So we actually only have, I think, time for one last question. I think from, actually two questions I'm going to ask. Maria, who is the target of the misinformation? Who is, who do the Russians expect to believe this kind of stuff?
It's three targets. So internal Russian audience, for them, the idea that Ukraine with the West are aggressors is being fed. Then for Ukrainians, they try to influence and sow chaos and panic on Ukrainian society. That's why those images of tanks coming to the border, tanks coming to Belarus, all kind of threatening stuff is being circulated all the time. And then for the Western audience, the other thing is being fed out through pro-Russian channels is that the West should not help, and Ukraine doesn't want that help. And Nebenza, the Russian ambassador to UN today, the UN Security Council said that it's only Ukrainian and Russian business, we don't have any problems, and that's West who is interfering. And by that, he feds up, and Russia feds up those in Western countries who think that it's probably the conflict. So they try to push that narrative that it's not the conflict where the West should be participating. So I guess they're working on all three directions.
Great. And finally, one last question. So Professor Matt Light, talks about is there any appetite in Ukraine for sort of a kind of non-aligned, status? I imagine, 10 years ago, there would have been quite an appetite for sort of, keeping Ukraine Finland style during the Cold War as a kind of non-aligned state. I mean, is that sort of off the table? Has Putin kind of ruined that option? I guess this is for both you and Maria and Oksana.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, just two quick things on this. I think, first of all, it is certainly much less, popular now than, it has been exactly because, of the Putin's actions. I would also further add, I think in Ukraine, most don't believe that it's just about NATO membership when Putin comes to Ukraine, right? So sort of this Finland option or Austria option, right? Like there was no narrative that it is somehow part of the same nation, right? Like, and in Ukraine, like we see that. I mean, Putin has, I think, much, if say this came to pass, that there was some sort of like, non-aligned, quote unquote, in other words, in Russia's sphere of influence, I think people would fear that it also would mean interference in all sorts of areas of domestic politics, from, language policy to memory politics to economics to anti-corruption, like the whole thing, right? So this sort of, that there is this firm border, it's not NATO, and if that's off the table, then we can live, peacefully. And like, I think very few in Ukraine buy that.
Maria? Hello, Maria?
Yeah. I also wanted to add that Putin is really obsessed with this idea of restoring USSR, and that is what he's constantly talking about. And for the last 2 months, it was very visible because they made a special documentary where Putin for 2 hours is telling stories about CIA agents coming to Moscow and how he himself felt humiliated by that, and how the Russia was humiliated by the West, and now he wants everything back. So I guess that is really his obsession. He wants this change. He wants to show to the people whom he thinks feel the same, that he is strong, and he wants to restore that influence he thought that the West had taken from Russia. And that's why I think he will be pushing no matter what. And Ukraine is essential in that, because without Ukraine, he cannot speak about restoration of the empire he lost.
Okay. So Tanya Brunitska has actually a great question. And this is for you, Brian. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about off-ramps in the media. I mean, really, does Putin need an off-ramp? Can you imagine him, just like putting troops there and then just gradually, doing nothing and just, winding them down, or does he need to do something in your mind?
Yeah, I honestly think he can build his own off-ramps if he needs one, right? I mean, I think in terms of domestic audience, there is an easy way to spin this, that NATO is now considering seriously proposals it wouldn't consider before, and there's room for discussions about issue X and issue Y and issue Z, whether it's about missile deployments or exercises, and then they can just say, we force NATO to accept our reasonable offers, and we're having discussions about this. And I'm not worried about any sort of domestic audience concerns, and globally, I don't think, people in the West or elsewhere would look at this and say, oh, Putin was forced to climb down. I think it would more be a feeling of relief, and also a feeling like this isn't over yet. So in that sense, I think there is a way for this not to escalate currently, if that's what he chooses to do.
Okay, so we're left basically with trying to figure out what's in one guy's head. Which we as political scientists are very well equipped to do, because we have all the equipment necessary to sort of see inside what he said. With that, final, thank you very much, Maria, Oksana, Brian, and thank you for the audience for wonderful questions. And we'll end it there. Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.